Our opening speaker this morning is Vice Admiral Walter E. Ted Carter. He is a 1981 graduate of the Naval Academy. He was designated a Naval Flight Officer in 1982, and he graduated Top Gun School in 1985. Vice Admiral Carter has accumulated 6,150 flight hours and safely completed 2,016 carrier landings, the record among all active and retired U.S. Naval Aviation designators. Vice Admiral Carter now serves as the 62nd Superintendent of the Naval Academy. Please join me in welcoming Vice Admiral Carter.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the United States Naval Academy. This is it's going to be an exciting couple of days. And I want to just set the tone here for why this conference is different than any other one that we've done here at the U.S. Naval Academy. As Midshipman Hansen and Midshipman German have done such a fantastic job coordinating this, spending well over a year to put this conference together. Not just the themes, not just the amazing speakers that you're going to hear tonight, like Mayor Michael Bloomberg, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Pete Pace, former Secretary of the Navy, and Assistant Secretary of Defense Gordon England. You're going to hear from all these folks. Pretty special to bring them here. But the coolest thing about this conference is that you're here. This is the largest one we've ever put together. There are 400 delegates from over 120 different schools across the nation, as well as 28 international students from across the world. And of course, our Naval Academy staff, some of our midshipmen, all here in historic Mahan Hall. Now, for those of you who have not been to the United States Naval Academy before, this is not just one of the leading academic institutions in the world, this is a historic site. So we know you'll get a chance to kind of get around the campus a little bit. We want you to see that. We're very fortunate. The weather, as challenging as it's been across the nation, was good enough here that everybody got here. A little cold out here today, and we'll warm up a little bit, but you'll have a chance to get around the yard, interact with some of our midshipmen, and really, this conference is for you. So as Mrs. Carter, my wife is here, by the way, and she attends most things, so it's great to have her here. I want to just share with you some thoughts that fit within the theme that you're going to hear through the next couple of days. And really, when you think about what this theme is, inside out leadership, it's really about what can you do to affect change. Now, in these discussions, let's make sure that we have a distinction between what leadership and management is. Leadership is about what you do to inspire others to either continue in doing something well or change something. And oftentimes we think about leadership starting at a very senior level, whether it be at a flag or general officer level for those in the military, at the top of industry for those that are in industry, or at the top of government. But what I want to tell you today, especially given the generations that are here, is leadership actually can be changed and most effective down at the junior officer or down at that junior personnel level. Now, as Midshipman Hansen introduced me, I've been around a long time. I have flown in multiple different types of airplanes off a lot of aircraft carriers, and as we come to know in naval aviation, there isn't anything about having any kind of tenure. In other words, you're only as good as your last night carrier landing. And the elements, the dynamics of flying a high-performance tactical jet aircraft on board a pitching deck of an aircraft carrier, you have to earn your pay every time. Now, I go back to the early 80s, and if you think about where our nation was and what we were doing in the early 80s, we were really into kind of a pure competition. Our United States Navy was approaching 600 ships. We had 15 aircraft carriers. We had a lot of resources in terms of numbers. But a lot of things that we were operating were very old. They were at the tail end of the Vietnam era. My first squadron, after Mrs. Carter and I had really just been married, was to join an overseas fighter squadron flying the F-4S Phantom II. And we were flying off the aircraft carrier USS Midway. So to give you an idea how old those two pieces of gear are, the USS Midway is a museum sitting in San Diego Harbor today. It was a ship built in 1945. It was the largest ship in the world when it was built. It was actually built to try to get us to the end of World War II. She stayed in service, and when I was flying off her in the early 80s, she was already well over 27, 28 years old. The F-4 Phantom was a product of the jet age. It was a two-seat cockpit, considered pretty high performance, high tactical, high technology in the early 1960s. And here we were still operating it as a frontline fighter in 1983. Now, the mission of our Navy at that time operating in the South China Sea was really against the Soviet Union. It was really a peer-to-peer competition, mostly cat and mouse type games, not a lot of weapons being fired, even though the Soviet Union had mistakenly shot down a Korean airliner on 1 October 1983, great loss of life, kind of really amped up this high tension that was going on. For those of us that were flying off the Midway, 9 squadrons, 4 tactical squadrons in terms of 2 fighter squadrons, 2 A7 squadrons, A7 Corsairs. And really, what we worried about day to day was just being able to fly safely and operate. The squadron that I had joined, VF 161, their nickname was the Rock Rivers, they had some real hard challenges. Just before I showed up, airplane crash landed on the back of Midway. The backseater, the radar intercept officer, he ejected out, safely survived, and the front seater died. Just a few months later, we had another accident, same squadron, off the catapult to Midway. F-4 was disconnected from the catapult. The catapult ran through the front end of the ship, created a whole bunch of debris. The F-4 flew through it, lost both its engines. Again, the backseater got out, and the front seater died. So here we have a squadron with only 15 pilots, 15 backseaters, and we have 2 lost aviators and 2 lost airplanes. The morale of this squadron, as you can imagine, was pretty low. And I'll remember distinctly after I got there, and I was new, I was only like 23, 24 years old, Lieutenant JG, sitting in that ready room listening to a bunch of our junior officers that got together. We said, we've got to change what's happening here. It's not just life and death, it's survival. And we kind of made a decision that we were going to change individually how the outcomes were going to happen in this squadron. A month later, one of our junior officers was piloting an F-4 at night. We were operating the South China Sea a couple hundred miles away from the Philippines. And in this particular airplane, he was just coming in, normal night landing, and he couldn't get aboard. He couldn't land. Went around a couple times, and as he was getting low on fuel, the call was made from the ship for him to go try to land in the Philippines on a long runway. So he was on low fuel, and he had to fly a specific profile to do this. And in this particular case, an emergency fuel profile is very simple. You go to full power, get up to a very, very high altitude, kind of coast, and then glide back down to land. Well, as he was climbing out, now about 100 miles away from Naval Air Station QB Point in the Philippines, they ran out of oxygen. Now, in these days, the oxygen system in the F-4 Phantom was basically a 2-liter liquid oxygen bottle. It would normally last 3 to 4 hours, but for whatever reason, after they were flying around for 2.5 hours, they ran out. So they took their masks off. Now, these aviators are in good shape. They should be able to handle flying around in a pressurized cockpit that'll be 7,000 or 8,000 feet when they get up to altitude. But again, aging airplanes, problems. They get up to 35,000 feet as he brings the throttles to idle. The bladders inside the canopy went to nothing. And all of a sudden, the cockpit altitude was 35,000 feet. Interestingly, the backseater in this airplane was the exact same backseater that was in the first mishap where the pilot died and the backseater lived. You can imagine what he was going through, thinking, okay, now we're at 35,000 feet, we have no oxygen. And he said, we've got a call to put emergency oxygen back on our faces. And as they went to reach for a ring inside their seat pan, he got his emergency oxygen on, and the front seater, Tom Allen, did not. And it only took about 20 seconds, and the front seater passed out. The airplane tipped over and started to descend. Our backseater, Rich Johnson, realizes that something's not right. He's yelling at his pilot to wake up. By the time he realizes that's not going to happen, he has to now make this very tough decision to eject both of them. And they're now passing 30,000 feet, descending very quickly. Rich Johnson was a pretty big guy, He ejected out of the airplane at 450 knots. He survived just fine, even though his shoulders were a little sore. Tom Allen, who had sat in that ready room with all of us saying we were going to individually change the outcome of how this squadron was going to go, left that cockpit at over 600 miles an hour, unconscious. Helmet ripped off his head, arms flailed out into the jet stream. He was basically a human wind dummy. He entered the water completely unconscious, still alive. And all of the automated features that were built into our survival gear at that time amazingly worked. His coke fittings that attached himself to his parachute became undone. His life raft blew up. His life preserver blew up. And now he was just attached to a plastic seat pan that had a whole bunch of survival gear in it. He became awake inside the water and realized he was alive. Dislocated both of his arm sockets. His front forearm was completely broken. His left wrist was broken, and he was battered and bruised. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. It's dark. They're in South China Sea, and they're about 40 miles away from the aircraft carrier. Now a helicopter is going out to try to catch them and find them. His helmet blew off his head, so all of his reflection gear is no longer there. He is just a black speck on the water. And he realizes that he can't float in the water because the sea state is so high, 8-foot waves is going to eventually drown him. So he has to get into his life raft. And this is the most amazing part. With all these injuries, basically both arms not really at his disposal, he somehow perseveres and gets himself into a life raft and gets to his emergency radio to radio where he is. He does get saved. And they bring them back to the Midway. They didn't bring him ashore, they brought him to the Midway. After all that we had gone through and all the challenges in that squadron, to see him come back alive, go into our ship's hospital, became an inspiration for that squadron. Now, you could look at this story and say it's a story of survival, but I've had a chance to get to know Lieutenant Tom Allen from that incident over the years. He went on to fly the F-14 Tomcat. He went on to be a very successful airline pilot after he basically became the bionic man and rebuilt both of his arms. And what's interesting about this is after that happened, that squadron went on a success run. It became the best squadron in the fleet. And I would credit the perseverance and the personal decisions that this young man made while he was in the water. He could have quit. He could have said, I can't do this. And this was at a time where nobody's ever heard this story. Could be a made-for-TV movie, could be a big-screen movie. So as you listen to people talk about their decisions and what they are doing in this conference, put yourself in those situations. Think, what would I do? Because regardless of whether you're going into the military, going into industry, into government, into private practice, you'll be faced with personal decisions that may not immediately look like life or death for you or for others, but will have great impact. So I hope you enjoy this conference here. We are thrilled and happy to welcome you here to the United States Naval Academy. This is a truly critical time in our nation and our world where decisions that each and every one of us make can contribute to the better good. Again, welcome all. Thank you all very much.